Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and yes, I am feeling a little bit better. For those of you who have been asking and sending their best wishes, thank you. Now look, we had so much fun doing the top 10 English rock bands that I simply had to do a follow-up. So of course here we have the top 10 American rock bands of all time. Some of you may know from previous episodes, I'm half American. I grew up in the States, and I had a lot of this music as a soundtrack to my youth, but I think to say I'm aware of their contemporary cultural relevance in the same way I am of the English bands would be a little bit disingenuous. That said, I think a great band's music and legacy, of course, will cross the pond, and I'd hope I'm just as qualified as any passionate, moderately intelligent and well-informed rock fan to pontificate and prattle on these bands' merits as anybody is. Oh my god, this list was so much harder than the English list. As I said in that video, a lot of those bands really were obvious and would pick themselves, but you know, here you had so many more great influential bands all roughly at the same level to take into account, and I feel a bit sheepish that I've left out some real humdingers. Once again, I'm going for impact, influence, legacy, sales and downright talent. Perhaps not all at the same time, but all of these bands display some of those qualities in spades. I know for a fact that this list will probably cause some hernias, heartbreak and howls of indignation, but I will again try and justify my choices, and I hope that we're still friends by the end. Even as I'm saying this, I'm wondering if I've made a couple of errors here or there, but look, if I have, I know you're going to let me know in the comments below afterwards. A couple of caveats, and that's there's no Bruce Springsteen and the Heartbreakers, and no Bruce Springsteen and the Heartbreakers. What a start. There's no Bruce Springsteen in the E Street Band and no Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers in this list. They will feature or may not feature in a future list for solo singers and songwriters. But let's get into it. Now, at number 10, I'm going to put a band who made only 3 albums, but they sold 94 million records. Do the maths there. They formed in 1989 and they are Nirvana. I'm also going to add to the stats this time Spotify followers, because I think it's a really good indication of how other younger generations are listening to music and what they're listening to. And Nirvana have 20 million Spotify followers. Now, Nirvana spearheaded a grunge rock movement that saw the death of the sort of poodle-permed, chiffon-clad pomp rock that had sort of got a little bit ridiculous by the early 90s. But I think it's undoubtedly the reputation of Kurt Cobain that cemented the band's place in rock history. He was never a virtuoso player. I think it's as a writer and a singer that he was really able to tap directly into kind of his rawest emotions, providing a sort of perfect mirror for millions of unhappy, disenfranchised teenagers all over the world. Nevermind was, of course, their massive multi-million selling classic, but the follow-up In Utero also has some really good songs all over it. Albeit ones you're probably less likely to hear on the radio. Smells Like Teen Spirit is, of course, you know, one of the great rock anthems of all time, and I think we'll be hearing that on the radio forevermore. You could argue that Nirvana are the single most influential band in the world of the last 25 years. And for that reason alone, they kind of had to be on this list. And in a strange way, their reputation is only deepened by Dave Grohl's incredible success with the Foo Fighters, who in another 10 years or so may well have made this list as well. Check back in 10 years. At number 9, a band who made 12 albums. They formed in 1978, 101 million sales and 9 million Spotify followers, and that's Van Halen. Now, American rock music had kind of got a little bit serious and pompous by the mid-70s. And it's almost like Van Halen turned up with a crate of beer and said, come on, chill out, everybody. Let's have a party. You know, David Lee Roth may not have been the best singer of all time, but he made up for that with just bags of energy and personality. And it's easy to forget just how huge Van Halen were. In the early 80s, they played the Pasadena Rose Bowl for a record $1.5 million. This is in the early 80s. Do the inflation maths there. And that's a sign of how massive they were. And this was even before Jump and 1984 came out. Roth left the band in 1985, but they had a second wind with the Red Rocker, Sammy Hagar. But their greatest legacy, apart from a catalogue, I think, of some of the most fun, hummable hard rock that there's ever been, is with Eddie Van Halen. Now, he almost overnight inspired a whole generation of kids to pick up their guitars and start tapping and shredding away. Now, as a professional guitar player myself, I cannot overstate how crucial this aspect is of his personal contribution to the instrument's development. And as it's the key instrument in rock itself, his importance in the sound and the direction of rock music as a whole. I mean, undoubtedly, if it weren't for Eddie Van Halen, a huge swathe of hard rock music just would sound a little bit different. It just wouldn't sound the way it sounds. So Van Halen, as great as they are made even more important in the timeline of rock music by their late great lead guitarist. At number 8, a band who formed in 1983, made 15 albums, 90 million sales, and 12 million Spotify followers. And that is a band many of you will know I really love, R.E.M. R.E.M. were the college radio darlings of the mid-80s who went on to sell millions of albums as their career developed. They finally broke through with the worldwide hit Losing My Religion in 1991. You know, they were intelligent, they were cerebral, this melodic, jangly music for the slightly more discerning music lover than, say, the average Bon Jovi fan. Steadfastly democratic and altruistic and environmentally aware, they weren't afraid to wear their politics on their sleeve, in much the same way that sort of Radiohead and U2 have also done throughout their career. They famously split up before their music or their friendship suffered, and I think there are very, very few bands' reputations or legacies that are as intact as REM's. It's a very clever thing to do, really, in a world as passionate and as unstable as the rock world. They've been a big influence on the slightly more melodic side of stadium rock, but Nirvana have cited them, Radiohead, Coldplay, Pearl Jam, the Smiths, all of whom have publicly come out and said they owe Georgia's finest a big debt. And from the influence and just downright record sales and talent and strength of their back catalogue, I think R.E.M. deserved a place in this list. Now, let's move on. Number 7, we change tack entirely. But a band who formed very similar time in 1983 have made 10 albums but sold 161 million records and have 17 million Spotify followers, and that is the mighty Metallica. Metallica are probably the biggest heavy metal band in the world. No, I say probably. They are the biggest heavy metal band in the world, and they have been for quite some time. They were already one of the leading metal bands of the 80s, alongside Megadeth, Iron Maiden, and Slayer, to name just a few. But it was with their self-titled Black Album in 1991 and tracks like Enter Sandman that they went absolutely stellar, selling 16 million albums and becoming, for a short period of time, the biggest band on the planet, which is no mean feat for a heavy metal band. Despite slightly waning sales ever since, the band has very much stayed in the public eye by headlining big festivals all over the world and releasing some brilliantly entertaining docu-films like Some Kind of Monster, an almost sort of Spinal Tap-like movie that is a must-see if you want to know how dysfunctional bunch of multi-millionaire rock stars deal with the day-to-day minutiae of being in such a huge band. Bands like Slipknot, Korn, Avenged Sevenfold, Trivium Dream Theater, you know, whether you listen to that kind of music or not, whether you even like it, there is simply is no denying that Metallica are a huge deal in that world of music, and have been since all of those bands sort of started forming their little branches off the heavy metal Metallica tree. And for that reason alone, Metallica, and well, not that reason alone, because of those incredible sales as well, they're just still to this day incredibly popular. And number 6, a band who formed in 1968, made 7 albums, 92 million sales, and have 15 million Spotify followers. And that's Creedence Clearwater Revival. For a band who perfected the swamp rock guitar boogie of the South, John Fogerty was ironically from California, but he was a man with a vision and a plan, and his talent has ensured a huge catalogue of hits that almost single-handedly define America, particularly during the nightmare of the Vietnam war years. You simply can't watch a film or a documentary about the war without a Credence song coming on the backing track. But look, take the war out of the equation, and you have one hell of a band. They had a kind of unique groove over which, Fogerty's sort of raspy voice would sing these blue-collar songs about being in a traveling band, being a hitchhiking man, eating catfish on the bayou. It was all a bit of a show because he was a California kid. But it sounded incredible. I mean, sadly, there's a lot of in-band fighting. And legal wranglings that prevented them from sustaining their success for too long. But it was a massive success while they had it. And decades of legal issues with the record company stopped John Fogerty from even pursuing a solo career for many years. But it's just not as easy as it sounds to create your own space in rock history. But, thanks to his voice and the band's groove and that moment they had in time, Creedence are undoubtedly a classic American rock band with the greatest hits that spans over 2 volumes. And the sheer depth and quality of all of that material is almost unparalleled on this list. At number 5, a band who formed in 1973, made 15 albums, 104 million sales, and 15 Spotify followers. 15 million Spotify followers, and that is Aerosmith. In many ways, they are the American Stones, aren't they? You've got Steve Tyler and Joe Perry being the Jagger and Richards roles. A comparison they've done very, very little to dissuade over the years. At their best, I think, with albums like Toys in the Attic, the band really does, it swings and it rocks, with melody and attitude. But, over the years, the substance abuse has made them lose their way a little bit in the 80s. They made a lot of very, very underwhelming records. But they did rise again like a phoenix in the mid to late 80s and conquered the MTV scene with songs like Walk This Way that they did with Run DMC. And after that, they had a sort of run of epic power ballads and then songs with sleazy musical innuendos. And, by the late 80s, they were bigger than ever. And, they survived the grunge years and they're still a huge live draw. And, they make this list for sheer longevity and commercial success. Van Halen, Motley Crue, Rat, Guns N' Roses, many, many more owe a debt to Aerosmith, who haven't always been one of my favourite bands, but I do love their best material. And now I think this top 4 now, I think the top 4 is really the 4 great iconic American rock bands. Tell me if I'm wrong, but these 4 had to be in this list, and I'm hoping you would agree with me. At number 4, band who formed in 1967, have by far and away the least commercial act on this list, with only 3 million sales. They made 5 albums and they have 3.5 million Spotify followers. But that is the utterly legendary Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground is simply one of the most important and influential bands of all time, regardless of what country you come from. And it's their very non-musicality that inspired thousands of kids to pick up a guitar and strum away in an out-of-tune chord for 20 minutes while everyone else was looking down at their shoes trying to look cool. Their overlord was, of course, Andy Warhol, the legendary pop artist. But the genius in the band was the singer and guitarist Lou Reed, one of the great American poets and musical icons. The band really wrote about graphic, dark social realism. They wrote about sex and kinkiness, and in an avant-garde way that was just too tough for the mainstream to follow. But kids over time, they lapped up this dark New York sound, and the amount of bands that have been influenced by the Velvet Underground is probably longer than any other amount of bands on this list, if you see what I'm saying. They've influenced more bands than any other bands on this list. That's what I'm trying to say. And despite, not having very many record sales at all, those first 4 albums have all made Rolling Stone's top 500 albums of all time, which is a real sign that their musical legacy is as strong and relevant as ever. But you look at the people, the stature of the people they've directly influenced, from Bowie to the Sex Pistols, U2, R.E.M., Patti Smith, the Smiths, Radiohead. I mean, it's just a sprawling, enormous list of equally influential artists, and many of them had their initial spark with the Velvet Underground. At number 3, another band who released their debut in 1967, have sold 160 million records and have 9 million Spotify followers, and that is The Doors. The Doors were the dark underbelly of the LA scene in the late 60s, and they had one of the most immediately identifiable sounds. You had this amazing mix of musicians. You had Ray Manzarek's classical piano, Robbie Krieger's Spanish guitar, John Densmore's jazzy drums, and you had Jim Morrison's bluesy vocals. And with that sound, they had a hugely successful run of 6 albums and hits until Jim Morrison died in a Paris bathtub in 1971. But it's his electrifying stage presence and his poetic lyrical ambitions. He really turned the lead singer into this kind of romantic character in a way we hadn't seen before, and it really set the band apart. And it's that romantic, enigmatic legacy that has meant the band will always be good copy. Whether it's in an Oliver Stone film or a slew of books that use the Doors in their music to reflect the seedier, more dangerous aspect of late 60s West Coast rock. Bands like The Cure, The Cult, Echo and the Bunnymen, Joy Division, all directly and hugely influenced by the Doors. At number 2, a band who formed in 1972, made 7 albums and sold a whopping 172 million records, 23 million Spotify followers, by far and away the most successful band on this list from numbers alone, and that is, of course, the Eagles. For sheer longevity and album sales, it's very hard not to put the Eagles very near the top of this list. Famously derided by David Crosby and the dude from The Big Lebowski, it's easy to dismiss their music, as Crosby once said, as being a mile wide and an inch thick. But it is 174 million units is hard to ignore. And when you listen to the Eagles, this is a band who had musical chops to spare. There's no question of it. They might not have had the cultural impact of say, the Velvet Underground, or even a band who didn't quite make the list like the Ramones. But, and certainly not as the same way that their contemporaries, the earlier bands like the Beatles and the Stones had. But, artists as diverse as Guns N' Roses and Motley Crue to Justin Timberlake and the late great Meatloaf, they've all cited the Eagles as an influence. So, we're looking at Motley Crue to Justin Timberlake. So what is this band offering people? Well, it's great music. It's wonderful songs, beautifully played. The band is still touring and selling out stadiums today, and I think they've got to the point where they've really transcended being a band, and people are now coming not to see the band on stage, but just to hear those songs that they've grown up with and have quite literally been the soundtrack to their lives, whoever is singing them. So that brings me to my number 1 American band of all time. Well, they've made 29 albums, 100 million sales, 10 million Spotify followers. They formed in the same year as the Beatles released their debut album, and that is the Beach Boys. I chuffing love the Beach Boys, I really do. In so many ways, the Beach Boys are America. No band has better defined how the rest of the world views the States in its most attractive form as the Beach Boys, with songs about sun, sea, surfing, girls, cars. The Beach Boys fused that infectious rhythms of rock and roll, and particularly Chuck Berry, with those peerless harmonies, and then that eccentric musical genius of Brian Wilson. They create a sound that is just as unique and identifiable today as it ever has been. No band sounds like the Beach Boys. Now, I know the Wrecking Crew played most of the instruments on their albums, and some of you may debate whether the Beach Boys are even a real band or not, and some of you will even say they're not a rock band. Go tell it to the tourists. you know, I feel there's something really, really important about the very idea of the Beach Boys, who in many ways gave to the States the same thing the Beatles gave to England in the 1960s. And that, you know, they empowered teenagers and gave them a safe cultural mast to hang their shirts on. You know, they looked good, they sounded great, and we still hear Beach Boys songs all over the cultural landscape across the world. There's a new Brian Wilson film coming out this very week. You know, and in a country that has produced many, many great eccentric geniuses, he could very well lay claim to being the greatest American musical eccentric genius of them all. Anyway, look, that's my list. For what it's worth, you know, I'm about to name check a load of bands who didn't make this list, and it's bewildering. The Ramones, Talking Heads, CSN, The Grateful Dead, Kiss, Steely Dan, Blondie, Talking Heads. I've said Talking Heads. The Strokes, the Pixies, the Byrds, ZZ Top, the Allman Brothers, Boston, Leonard Skinner, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Oh my God, I could just go on and on. You could make a brilliant, brilliant list with those bands alone. But I did consider all of them for this list. So I've tried not to ignore any of the obvious contenders. But that's my list for this week. Do tell me what you think. And also I have started on my community page regular polls, which I am enjoying seeing many of you contribute to. So do look out for that as well going forward. There'll be something up on there every 2 or 3 days for you to vote on. But look, that's my list. Let me know what you think. Like I said, I hope none of you have had a hernia. But I'm sure I will see and read all your howls of indignation. So thanks for watching. I'll be back very soon with another list, Rock Records Reviewed. Thanks. Bye-bye.